Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, Chapter 9. When I reached home, my sister was very curious to know all about Miss Havisham's, and asked a number of questions, and I soon found myself getting heavily bumped from behind, in the nape of the neck and the small of the back, and having my face ignominiously shoved against the kitchen wall, because I did not answer those questions in sufficient length. If the dread of not being understood be hidden in the breasts of other young people like the extent to which it was being hidden in mine, which I consider probable, as I have no particular reason to suspect myself of having been a monstrosity. It is the key to many reservations. I felt convinced that I described Miss Havisham as my eyes had seen it. I should not be understood. Not only that, but I felt convinced that Miss Havisham too would not be understood. And although she was perfectly incomprehensible to me, I entertained an impression that there would be something coarse and treacherous in my dragging her as she really was, to say nothing of Miss Estella, before the contemplation of Mrs. Joe. Consequently, I said as little as I could, and had my face shoved against the kitchen wall. The worst of it was that bullying old Pumblechook preyed upon my devouring curiosity to be informed of all I had seen and heard, came gaping over in his chaise cart at tea time, to have the details divulged to him. And the mere sight of the torment, with his fishy eyes and mouth open, his sandy hair inquisitively on end, and his waistcoat heaving with windy arithmetic, made me vicious in my resentence. "Well, boy," Uncle Pumblechook began as soon as he was seated in the chair by the fire, "how did you get on uptown?" I answered, "Pretty well, sir," and my sister shook her fist at me. "Pretty well," Mr. Pumblechook repeated. "Pretty well is no answer. Tell us what you mean by pretty well, boy." "Whitewash on the forehead hardens the brains to the state of obstinacy, perhaps. Anyhow, with whitewash from the wall on my forehead, my obstinacy was admitted. I reflected for some time, and then answered as if I had discovered a new idea. "I mean, pretty well." My sister, with an exclamation of impatience, was going to fly at me. I had no shadow of defense, for Joe was busy in the forge, when Mr. Pumblechook interposed with, "No, don't lose your temper. Leave this lad to me, ma'am. Leave this lad to me." Mr. Pumblechook then turned me up towards him, as if he were going to cut my hair, and said, "First, to get our thoughts in order, 43 pence." I calculated the consequences of replying £400, and finding them against me, went as near the answer as I could, which was somewhere about 8 pence off. Mr. Pumblechook then put me through my pence table from 12 pence to make 1 shilling, up to 40 pence make 3 and 4 pence, and then triumphantly demanded, as if he had done for me, "Now, how much is 43 pence?" To which I replied, after a long interval of reflection, "I don't know." And I was so aggravated that I almost doubt if I did know. Mr. Pumblechook worked his head like a screw to screw it out of me, and said, "Is 43 pence 7 and 6 pence 3 fardens, for instance?" "Yes," said I, and although my sister instantly boxed my ears, it was highly gratifying to me to see that the answer spoilt his joke, and brought him to a dead stop. "Boy, what like is Miss Havisham?" Mr. Pumblechook began again, when he had recovered, folding his arms tight on his chest and applying the screw. "Very tall and dark," I told him. "Is she, uncle?" asked my sister. Mr. Pumblechook winked assent, from which I at once inferred that he had never seen Miss Havisham, for she was nothing of the kind. "Good," said Mr. Pumblechook conceitedly. "This is the way to have him. We are beginning to hold our own, I think, mum." "I am sure, uncle," returned Mrs. Joe, "I wish you had always him. You know how well to deal with him." "Now, boy, what was she doing when you went in today?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. "She was sitting," I answered, "in a black velvet coach." Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another, as they well might, and both repeated, "In a black velvet coach." "Yes," said I, "and Miss Estella, I think that's her niece, I think handed her in cake and wine at the coach window on a gold plate, and we all had cake and wine on gold plates, and I got up behind the coach to eat mine because she told me to." "Was there anyone else?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. "4 dogs," said I. "Large or small?" "Immense," said I, "and they fought for veal cutlets out of a silver basket." Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another again in utter amazement. I was perfectly frantic, a reckless witness under the torture, and would have told them anything. "Where was this coach, in the name of gracious?" asked my sister. "In Miss Havisham's room." They stared again. "But there weren't any horses to it," I added this saving clause in the moment of rejecting forestry comparison. coursers which I had wild thoughts of harnessing. "Can this be possible, uncle?" asked Mrs. Joe. "What can the boy mean?" "I'll tell you, Mum," said Mr. Pumblechook. "My opinion is, it's a sedan chair. She's flighty, you know, very flighty, quite flighty enough to pass her days in a sedan chair." "Did you ever see her in it, uncle?" asked Mrs. Joe. "How could I?" he returned, forced to the admission, "when I never see her in my life, never clapped eyes upon her." "Goodness, uncle, and yet you have spoken to her." "Why, don't you know," asked Mr. Pumblechook testily, "that when I have been there I have been took up to the outside of her door, and the door stood just ajar. She has spoke to me that way. Don't you say that I don't know, Miss Mum. However, the boy went there to play." "What did you play at, boy?" "We played at flags," said I. I began to observe, to think of myself with amazement, when I recalled the lies I told on this occasion. "Flags?" echoed my sister. "Yes," said I. "Estella waved a blue flag, and I waved a red one, and Miss Havisham waved one sprinkled all over with little gold stars, out of the coach window, and then we all waved our swords and hurrahed." "Swords?" repeated my sister. "Where did you get swords from?" "Out of a cupboard," said I, "and I saw pistols in it, and jam, and pills. There was no daylight in the room, but it was all lighted up with candles." "That's true, Mum," said Mr. Pumblechook with a grave nod. "That's the state of the case, for that much I've seen myself." And then they both stared at me, and I, with the obtrusive show of artlessness on my countenance, stared at them, and plaited the right leg of my trousers with my right hand. If I had asked any more questions I should undoubtedly have betrayed myself, for I was even then on the point of mentioning that there was a balloon in the yard, and should have hazarded the statement but for my invention being divided between the phenomenon and a bear in the brewery. They were so much occupied, however, in discussing the marvels I had already presented for their consideration, that I escaped. The subject still held them when Joe came in from his work to have a cup of tea, to whom my sister, more in the relief of her own mind than for the gratification of his, related my pretended experiences. Now when I saw Joe open his blue eyes and roll them all around the kitchen in helpless amazement, I was overtaken by penitence, but only as regarded him, not in the least as regarded the other two. Towards Joe, and Joe only, I considered myself a young monster, while they sat debating what results would come to me from Miss Havisham's acquaintance and favour. They had no doubt that Miss Havisham would do something for me. Their doubts related to the form that something would take. My sister stood out for property. Mr. Pumblechook was in favour of a handsome premium for binding me apprentice to some genteel trade, say the corn and seed trade, for instance. Joe fell into the deepest disgrace with both, for offering the bright suggestion that I might only be presented with one of the dogs who had fought for the veal cutlets. "If a fool's head can't express better opinions than that," said my sister, "and you have got any work to do, you had better go do it." So he went. After Mr. Pumblechook had driven off, and when my sister was washing up, I stole into the forge to Joe, and remained by him until he had done for the night. Then I said, "Before the fire goes out, Joe, I should like to tell you something." "Should you, Pip?" asked Joe, drawing his shoeing stool near the forge. "Then tell us, what is it, Pip?" "Joe," said I, taking hold of his rolled-up sleeve, and twisting it before my finger and thumb, "you remember all about Miss Havisham's." "Remember," said Joe. "I believe you. Wonderful. It's a terrible thing, Joe. It ain't true." "What are you telling of, Pip?" cried Joe, falling back to the greatest amazement. "You don't mean to say it's—" "Yes, I do, Joe. It's lies." "But not all of it. Why, sure you don't mean to say, Pip, that there was no black velvet coach?" For I stood shaking my head. "But at least there were dogs, Pip." "Come, Pip," said Joe persuasively. "If there weren't no veal cutlets, at least there was dogs." "No, Joe, a dog," said Joe, "a puppy. Come." "No, Joe, there was nothing of the kind." As I fixed my eyes hopelessly on Joe, Joe contemplated me in dismay. "Pip, old chap, this won't do, old fellow, I say. Where do you expect to go to?" "It's terrible, Joe, ain't it?" "Terrible!" cried Joe. "Awful! What possessed you?" "I don't know what possessed me, Joe," I replied, letting his shirt sleeve go, and sitting down on the ashes at his feet, hanging my head. "But I wish you hadn't taught me to call knaves at cards jacks, and I wish my boots weren't so thick nor my hands so coarse." And then I told Joe that I felt very miserable, and that I hadn't been able to explain myself to Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook, who were so rude to me, and that there had been a beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's who was dreadfully proud, and that she said I was common, and that I knew I was common, and that I wished I was not common, and that the lies had come of somehow, though I didn't know how. This is a case of metaphysics. At least it's different for Joe to deal with this from me. But Joe took the case altogether out of the region of metaphysics, and by that means vanquished it. "There's one thing you may be sure of, Pip," said Joe, after some rumination, "namely that lies is lies. However they come, they ought not to come, and they come from the father of lies, and work round to the same. Don't you tell no more of 'em, Pip. That ain't the way to get out of being common, old chap. As to being common, I don't make it all clear. You are uncommon in some things. You're uncommon small, likewise you're an uncommon scholar. No, I am ignorant and backward, Joe. Why, see what a letter you wrote last night, wrote it in print even. I've seen letters, and from gentle folks, that I'll swear weren't wrote in print, said Joe. I've learnt the next to nothing, Joe. You think much of me, it's only that. Well, Pip, said Joe, be it so or be it so, and you must be a common scholar afore you can be a common one. I should hope the king upon his throne, with his crown upon his head, can sit and write his acts of parliament in print without having began, when he were an unprompted prince, with the alphabet. Ah, added Joe, with a shake of his head that was full of meaning, and began at A too, and worked his way to Z, and I can know what I do and say, though I can't say exactly what I've done it. There was some hope in this piece of wisdom, and it rather encouraged me, for their common ones as to calling and earnings persuaded Joe, reflectively, mightn't be the better of continuing for to keep company with common ones instead of going out to play with uncommon ones, which reminds me of hope that there were red flags perhaps. No, Joe, I'm sorry there weren't a flag pit. Whether that might be or mightn't be isn't a thing that can be looked into now without putting your sister on the rampage, and that's a thing that ought not to be as being done intentional. Look ye here, Pip, at what is said by you a true friend, which this is you the true friend say, if you can get to be uncommon through going straight, you'll never get to do it through going crooked. So don't tell no more of him, Pip, and live well and die happy. You're not angry with me, Joe, no, old chap, but bearing in mind that they were, which I mean to say, of a stunning and audacious sort, alluding to them which bordered on veal cutlets and dog fighting and sincere well-wisher, would advise Pip their being dropped into your meditations when you go upstairs to bed, that's all, old chap, and don't ever do it no more. When I got up to my little room and said my prayers, I did not forget Joe's recommendation, and yet my young mind was in the disturbed and unthankful state that I thought long after I had laid down how common Estella would consider Joe, a mere blacksmith, how thick his boots and how coarse his hands. I thought how Joe and my sister were then sitting in the kitchen, and how I had come up to the bed from the kitchen, and how Miss Havisham and Estella never sat in a kitchen, but were far above the level of such common doings, and I fell asleep recalling what I used to do when I was at Miss Havisham's, as though it had been there weeks or months instead of hours, and the thought of it was quite as old subject of remembrance instead of one that had risen only that day. That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me, but is it the same in any life? Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, ye who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron and gold, of thorns or flowers that would never have bound you, but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day.